In the sample size annexes in the WHO manual, we've tried to lay out a series of steps that will result in a sample size calculation that you can use. We've laid out the process of how to calculate the sample size in a clear manner, but we haven't necessarily made the case there of why you should use this method as opposed to another method. Some of you may be thinking of other methods that you've used and thinking, why wouldn't we use that? Why wouldn't we use something more familiar? Some of you may be asking the same question that Shakespeare's tragic hero asks, and that is, to use Annex B or not to be? That is the question. One alternative that you might be thinking of using is the old WHO recommendation of collecting data in 30 clusters and 7 respondents each in each stratum. This was a standard recommendation for a long time, and a lot of fine surveys have been done using this design, but we're moving away from it now. One of the guiding principles in the new guidelines, the revised guidelines, is that we identify the goal first and we size the survey to meet that goal if it's affordable. In some cases, a 30 by 7 would give you more precision than you need, and in some cases it wouldn't give you enough precision for the decisions you need to make. So it's better to decide ahead of time what you need. And there's another small point in that we no longer recommend a quota sample. We wouldn't say collect data from 7 respondents in every cluster. In the new manual, we recommend instead that you identify a pre-specified number of households. You visit those households and you interview every eligible respondent in those households. So the number of respondents will vary from cluster to cluster. Well, you may say, hey, the WHO's 2005 cluster survey manual, it had an annex on how to size your survey to meet estimation goals. Why wouldn't we use those tables in the old annex? And there are 3 reasons why I recommend that you not use those tables. First, they're based on walled confidence intervals, and I'm going to describe in some detail in a moment why I don't think walled confidence intervals are correct for this work. They're easy to calculate, but they're not appropriate, so we don't want to use those. Second, those tables only give you sample sizes for estimating coverage, not for classifying coverage, and the new annexes give tables for both, so they're more flexible. And finally, even if you liked walled confidence intervals and you only wanted to estimate coverage, the tables in the 2005 manual contain some calculation errors, so they simply shouldn't be used. Well, some of you are saying, I know the standard formula from my survey textbook or from the DHS and mix reports for calculating sample size, and those use walled confidence intervals, so what's the problem? Why are you saying they're not appropriate here? And it's because a DHS or a mix has a very big sample size in most strata. Their primary target population is women of childbearing age, and they interview a lot of them. Our sample sizes will usually be more modest in a vaccination coverage survey, certainly in the lower level strata. The confidence intervals will sometimes be quite wide, and those intervals should be asymmetric, not symmetrical. I'll show you a slide in a moment. The analysis plan should calculate asymmetric intervals. That's what you should put in your figures and your tables. And so if that's what you're going to do in the analysis, then I think that's what you should also do when you're calculating the sample size. So let's look at a picture. Here we have some walled intervals shown in red and some Wilson intervals shown in green. These are 95% confidence intervals. They're shown in 2 dimensions. There's more confidence where the shape is higher and less confidence out at the ends. We see here, if we put a little ruler over the figure, we see that when the estimated proportion is 50%, walled and Wilson are essentially equal. They're symmetrical and they're essentially equal. But if we go far from 50%, if we go out to an estimated proportion of 99%, well, first of all, we see that the walled interval is nonsensical. The upper limit of the interval is higher than 100%. Of course, we know the proportion can't be higher than 100%. It's appropriate for the interval to have more confidence to the left of 99%, for it to be asymmetric, because there are more ways that we could have true coverage be low and have received a lucky sample at 99% than there are for true coverage to be higher and for us to have received an unlucky sample at 99%. The Wilson intervals are appropriately asymmetric, and they do not extend up even to 100% and not beyond 100% here. Sometimes they do extend to 100%, but never beyond. As we move from the far end at 100% back toward 50%, we see that the intervals are still asymmetric. They are increasingly symmetric as we move back toward 50%. But I want you to report the asymmetric intervals no matter what your estimated coverage is, because I believe that they're more appropriate. You know, there's a principle that's been described across cultures and through time. If you are a merchant or a seller of goods, then in order for you to be judged as being just or virtuous, you need to use the same scales when you're buying goods that you use when you're selling goods. You need to use a fair scale, not a biased scale. And you know, when we tell a survey steering committee that a particular sample size will yield confidence intervals of a particular width, there's a sense in which we are buying something. And when we're asking them to buy something, we're asking them to buy a survey of this size. And then when we report confidence intervals, later in the report, there's a sense in which we are selling something. And if you calculate the sample size using the Wald formula, but in the report you report Wilson intervals or Fleiss intervals, the intervals may not be as narrow as you promised, especially when coverage is near 0% or 100%. So I think it makes sense to use the same interval to calculate the sample size that you're going to use in the analysis section of the report. We mentioned in an earlier video this abbreviated overview of the sample size method. You select the primary outcome, and then you learn from the committee what precision would they accept. What's the widest precision that they would be willing to accept for that outcome. And then you calculate the effective sample size that gives a Wald confidence interval with the desired precision. This is the standard method, using the Wald confidence interval. And then that would be for a simple random sample. You inflate it for several other factors. Well, we're just going to modify this method a very little bit for Annex B here. First, we allow inputs either for estimation or for classification. And then, instead of using the Wald intervals, we're going to use Wilson intervals. In the Fleiss book, they use Wilson intervals with a continuity correction. So sometimes I call those Fleiss intervals. Fleiss didn't call them Fleiss intervals, but I call them Fleiss intervals sometimes, because they are the intervals recommended in that textbook, Statistical Methods for Rates and Proportions. So to sum up, our recommendation is that you should use the same intervals in the sample size calculation that you use in the report, in the results section of the report. Wald intervals are not right for the job here. When the sample sizes are modest, the confidence intervals should be asymmetric. When you have really big sample sizes, both the Wilson and the Wald would give you symmetric intervals. But when the sample sizes are modest, we want to report asymmetric intervals. There's a small discrepancy. When you read the current draft of the manual, it's recommending Klopper-Pearson intervals. Those are fine asymmetric intervals, and we could stick with those. But in keeping with this principle of using the same intervals in the sample size calculation and what we're going to report, when we update the manual here in the fall of 2017, we'll change the recommendation to recommend Wilson intervals with a continuity correction, as suggested by Fleiss. So thanks very much. If you have questions about these ideas, I would welcome the opportunity to correspond with you about them. Thanks for your time.